What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses goes head-to-head with late-night television's most self-righteous host? You won't believe what unfolds when Julia Roberts sits down with Stephen Colbert for what was supposed to be a lighthearted promotional interview, only to witness the most explosive confrontation in late-night history. The tension that erupted last night has left the entertainment world reeling, and you're about to see exactly how it all went down. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when America's sweetheart takes on the king of condescension in a battle that nobody saw coming. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was supposed to be just another stop on Julia Roberts' promotional tour. For her latest film, the Oscar-winning actress had appeared on the show multiple times before, always charming audiences with her infectious laugh and down-to-earth personality. But something was different from the moment she walked onto that familiar stage last night. The usual warmth that typically radiates from Roberts seemed subdued, replaced by a guardedness that sharp-eyed viewers immediately picked up on. Colbert, meanwhile, appeared to be in one of his more pompous moods, the kind that regular viewers have grown accustomed to, but celebrities often find jarring when experienced firsthand. As Roberts settled into the guest chair, adjusting her elegant black blazer, there was an unmistakable tension crackling in the studio air that even the live audience seemed to sense. "Julia Roberts, everybody," Colbert announced with his trademark theatrical flourish, but his smile seemed more calculated than genuine. "Always a pleasure to have you back on the show. Though I have to say, I'm curious about some of the choices you've been making lately." Roberts' famous smile flickered for just a moment. "Choices? Well, Stephen, I'd like to think I've been making pretty good ones for the past few decades." "Oh, absolutely," Colbert replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was setting up for something bigger. "I mean, your career has been incredible. Pretty Woman, Erin Brockovich, Eat, Pray, Love. Though I have to ask about this new film of yours. Some critics are saying it's a bit of a departure from your usual feel-good message." The camera caught Roberts shifting slightly in her chair, her posture becoming more defensive. "I think audiences are smart enough to appreciate different kinds of stories, Stephen. Not everything has to be wrapped up in a neat little bow." "Right, right," Colbert nodded, but his expression suggested he was just getting warmed up. "But don't you think, as someone with your platform and influence, there's a certain responsibility to the messages you put out there, especially in today's climate?" This was where seasoned Colbert watchers knew he was transitioning into lecture mode, that insufferable tendency he had to position himself as the moral authority on whatever topic struck his fancy. Roberts, however, wasn't having it. "I'm sorry, are you questioning my judgment as an artist?" Roberts asked, her voice taking on a sharper edge that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Not questioning, just wondering," Colbert replied with that smug half-smile that had irritated countless guests before her. "I mean, when you have the kind of influence you do, when people look up to you the way they do, don't you think there's an obligation to use that responsibly?" The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Roberts' publicist, sitting in the wings, was visibly tense, probably wondering if she should intervene. But Roberts was far from finished. "Stephen, I've been in this business for over 30 years, she said, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of steel. "I've made my choices based on what I believe in, what moves me as an artist and as a person. I don't need a lecture from a talk show host about responsibility." The phrase, talk show host, landed like a slap. Colbert prided himself on being more than just entertainment, positioning himself as a cultural commentator and moral voice. To be dismissed as merely a talk show host by one of Hollywood's biggest stars was clearly a blow to his ego. "Well, I think being a talk show host gives me a pretty good perspective on what audiences are thinking," Colbert shot back, his pleasant demeanor beginning to crack. "And I have to say, some of the feedback on your recent projects has been interesting." "Interesting how?" Roberts challenged, leaning forward in her chair. The famous smile was completely gone now, replaced by a look of genuine irritation. "Well, let's just say not everyone is buying what you're selling anymore," Colbert replied, and the studio audience gasped audibly at the barely veiled insult. Roberts sat back in her chair, studying Colbert with a look that could have frozen fire. "Me? I'm just saying," Colbert continued, clearly emboldened by what he perceived as having the upper hand. "Maybe it's time to acknowledge that the Julia Roberts brand isn't quite what it used to be. The pretty woman thing only works for so long." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usually chatty studio audience was completely quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Robert's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to hurt to something much more dangerous. "The pretty woman thing?" she repeated slowly, her voice dropping to a level that made everyone in the studio lean forward to hear her. Colbert, apparently oblivious to the fact that he had just crossed a line from which there might be no return, pressed on with his characteristic arrogance. "Look, I'm not trying to be harsh here, but let's be honest about where your career is right now versus where it was 20 years ago. What happened next would be replayed on social media thousands of times over the following hours, but nothing could capture the electric tension of being in that studio as Julia Roberts, one of the most professional and gracious actresses in Hollywood, finally reached her breaking point with Stephen Colbert's insufferable condescension. But that was just the beginning of what would become the most talked-about late-night television moment in years, as the confrontation was about to escalate far beyond anyone's expectations. Roberts sat completely still for what felt like an eternity, her eyes locked on Colbert with an intensity that made the cameras seem to zoom in automatically. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured but loaded with barely contained fury. "Stephen, I want to make sure I heard you correctly," she said, each word deliberate and precise. "Are you suggesting that my 3-decade career, my Oscar, my multiple Golden Globes, and the trust that audiences have placed in me for years is somehow, what did you call it? Not what it used to be?" Colbert, perhaps sensing he had ventured into dangerous territory but too proud to back down, doubled down with the kind of arrogance that had made him enemies throughout Hollywood. "Julia, I'm just being honest here. The numbers don't lie. Your last few films haven't exactly set the box office on fire." "The numbers," Roberts repeated, and anyone who knew her well would have recognized the warning signs in her tone. "So we're reducing art to numbers now? We're reducing human stories, the craft of acting, the collaborative effort of hundreds of people, to opening weekend figures?" "Well, this is show business," Colbert replied with a shrug that was so dismissive it made several audience members audibly gasp. "At the end of the day, it's about what sells tickets." "Coming from someone whose show has been hemorrhaging viewers for the past 2 years," Roberts shot back, and the precision of the comeback caught even Colbert off guard. "Maybe we should talk about your numbers, Stephen." The host's face flushed red, his carefully constructed persona beginning to crack. "My show is doing just fine, thank you very much. We have a very engaged, very intelligent audience." "Engaged enough to keep you from getting canceled?" Roberts asked sweetly, but there was venom beneath the sugar. "Because from what I hear, the network has been having some very serious conversations about your future." This was clearly news to the studio audience, who erupted in surprised murmurs. Colbert's jaw tightened visibly, and for a moment, the mask of the genial host slipped. "Completely? I think you're confusing me with someone else," he said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "My contract was just renewed." "For how many years?" Roberts pressed, and the silence that followed was answer enough. "1 year? That's not exactly a vote of confidence, is it?" What happened next would be analyzed by media critics for weeks to come. Instead of gracefully changing the subject or finding a way to diffuse the tension, Colbert made the fatal mistake of trying to reassert his dominance by going for what he thought would be the killing blow. "Look, Julia, I know this is probably hard to hear, but maybe it's time to face some hard truths about where you are in your career, he said, leaning back in his chair with renewed smugness. The romantic comedy queen thing was great for a while, but audiences have moved on. They want something more substantial now. The phrase romantic comedy queen hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Roberts had built a career that spanned genres, from drama to thriller to comedy, but Colbert was attempting to reduce her entire body of work to a dismissive stereotype. Something more substantial, Roberts repeated, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. Like a late-night show where you spend most of your time making jokes about politicians and patting yourself on the back for being so clever? I provide commentary on important issues, Colbert replied defensively. I inform people about what's happening in the world. You mean you preach to people who already agree with you? Roberts corrected. When was the last time you actually changed anyone's mind about anything? When was the last time you had a guest on who challenged your worldview instead of just showing up to be your yes man? The accusation stung because it contained more than a grain of truth. Colbert's show had become increasingly insular, appealing to a specific demographic while alienating others. Roberts was essentially calling him out for being irrelevant, and she was doing it on his own show. I think you're deflecting from the real issue here, Colbert said, trying to regain control of the conversation. Which is that maybe it's time for you to acknowledge that the industry has passed you by. The industry has passed me by? Roberts laughed, but there was no humor in it. Stephen, I'm still getting offered roles. I'm still making films. I'm still working with the best directors in the business. What are you doing besides sitting behind this desk and being bitter about the fact that your relevance peaked about 5 years ago? The personal nature of the attack clearly rattled Colbert, who was used to being the one dishing out the criticism rather than receiving it. His composure was slipping badly, and everyone in the studio could see it. At least I'm still culturally relevant, he snapped back. At least people still care about what I have to say. Do they, though? Roberts asked, tilting her head with mock curiosity. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're desperately trying to stay relevant by attacking your guests. Is that what this is? Are you so threatened by successful women that you have to tear them down to make yourself feel better? The accusation of misogyny was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. Colbert's face went from red to purple, and his voice took on a sharp edge that his regular viewers had never heard before. Don't you dare try to make this about gender, he said, pointing his finger at her in a gesture that looked more threatening than professional. This is about talent, about staying current, about not living in the past. Is it? Roberts asked, standing up from her chair suddenly, which caught everyone off guard. Because it seems to me like this is about a man who can't handle being called out by a woman who's actually accomplished something meaningful with her life. The studio was in complete chaos now, with audience members looking around uncertainly, cameras still rolling, and producers frantically trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial. But Roberts wasn't finished. You want to know what's really sad, Stephen? She continued, towering over him as he remained seated. You used to be funny, you used to be clever. Now you're just angry and bitter, and you're taking it out on people who are still actually creating something worthwhile. Colbert finally stood up, his height advantage making the confrontation even more intense. I don't have to sit here and listen to this from someone whose career peaked in 1990. That was the moment when Julia Roberts finally lost all pretense of politeness, and what she said next would be the quote that dominated social media for days to come. You know what, Stephen? Roberts said, her voice rising to a level that carried across the entire studio. My career peaked in 1990. At least I had a peak. At least I created something that people actually loved instead of just tolerated. You're sitting there judging me while your own show is circling the drain because nobody wants to watch a bitter, washed-up comedian pretend to be a journalist. The words hit Colbert like physical blows. His face went from purple to ashen, and for a moment he seemed genuinely speechless. The audience was completely silent, many of them holding their breath as they witnessed the complete destruction of the show's carefully maintained facade. "You don't know what you're talking about," Colbert finally managed, but his voice was shaky and uncertain. "Don't I?" Roberts shot back, her famous smile returning but with a razor's edge. "I know that your ratings have been dropping for 2 years. I know that the network is looking for your replacement. I know that you're so desperate to stay relevant that you're willing to attack your guests just to generate some buzz. How's that working out for you?" Colbert tried to regain his composure, straightening his tie and attempting to return to his host persona. "I think we should probably move on to talking about your new film." "Oh, now you want to talk about my film?" Roberts laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. "After spending the last 10 minutes trying to convince everyone that I'm some washed-up has-been? After reducing my entire career to a punchline? Now you want to be professional?" "Julia, I think you're overreacting," Colbert said, making perhaps the worst possible choice of words in that moment. "Overreacting?" Roberts repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Stephen, let me tell you something about overreacting. Overreacting would be if I walked over there and slapped that smug expression off your face. Overreacting would be if I told everyone exactly what I think about your pathetic attempt to stay relevant by bullying your guests. This is me being remarkably restrained." The threat, delivered with Robert's characteristic smile, sent a visible shiver through the studio. Even the camera operators seemed to lean in, sensing that television history was being made. Colbert's producer was frantically gesturing from the wings, trying to signal for a commercial break, but both host and guest were too locked in their battle to pay attention. The confrontation had taken on a life of its own. "I wasn't bullying anyone," Colbert protested weakly. "I was asking legitimate questions about your career trajectory." "Legitimate questions?" Roberts scoffed. "You called me a has-been. You suggested that audiences don't want to see me anymore. You reduced my entire body of work to the pretty woman thing. If that's your idea of legitimate journalism, then I understand why your show is failing." "My show is not failing," Colbert insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it, though?" Roberts pressed. "When was the last time anyone talked about your show for something other than a political rant? When was the last time you had a viral moment that wasn't just you preaching to the choir? You're so desperate for relevance that you're willing to attack Oscar winners just to get people talking." The accuracy of her assessment was brutal. Colbert's show had indeed been struggling to find its footing in an increasingly crowded late-night landscape. His attempts to position himself as a moral authority had begun to feel stale and self-righteous, and Roberts was essentially holding up a mirror to show him exactly what he had become. "You know what the really sad part is?" Roberts continued, her voice taking on a tone of genuine pity that was somehow more devastating than her anger. "You used to be talented. You used to be someone worth watching. But somewhere along the way, you decided that being right was more important than being entertaining. You decided that lecturing people was more valuable than making them laugh. And now look at you, reduced to attacking your guests because you can't figure out how to be relevant anymore." Colbert stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Everything Roberts was saying rang true, and the worst part was that she was saying it in front of a live studio audience and millions of viewers at home. "I provide important commentary," he said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "You provide an echo chamber," Roberts corrected. "You tell people what they already believe, and then pat yourself on the back for being so insightful. That's not commentary, Stephen. That's just narcissism with a bigger budget." The final insult hung in the air like a death sentence. Colbert's face went through a range of emotions: anger, humiliation, defeat, before settling on something that looked almost like surrender. "I think this interview is over," he said quietly. "Oh, it's been over for a while," Roberts replied, reaching down to unhook her microphone. "The question is whether you're going to learn anything from it." She handed the microphone to a stunned production assistant and turned back to face Colbert one last time. "You know, Stephen, I came here tonight to promote a film that I'm proud of, to talk about a project that means something to me. Instead, I got attacked by someone who's apparently forgotten what it means to be a decent human being. That says a lot more about you than it does about me." The studio was so quiet that the sound of Robert's heels clicking on the floor as she walked toward the exit seemed to echo like gunshots. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's biggest stars prepared to walk off the set of a major network television show. But Roberts wasn't quite finished. She paused at the edge of the stage and turned back to address the audience directly, bypassing Colbert entirely. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight," she said, her voice warm and genuine in a way that highlighted just how cold and artificial the preceding conversation had been. "I hope you'll check out my new film, and I hope you'll remember that celebrities are human beings too. We deserve to be treated with the same respect and dignity that everyone else does." She looked back at Colbert one final time, and her expression was almost sad. "I hope you figure out who you want to be, Stephen, because this version of you isn't working for anyone." And with that, Julia Roberts walked off the set of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, leaving behind a host who looked utterly defeated, and an audience that had just witnessed the most explosive late-night television confrontation in recent memory. The cameras continued rolling for several seconds, capturing Colbert's stunned expression and the awkward silence that filled the studio. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We'll be right back after this commercial break." But everyone knew that this was one break that wasn't going to fix anything. The damage had been done, the confrontation was over, and Julia Roberts had walked away with her dignity intact while leaving Stephen Colbert to pick up the pieces of what had once been his reputation as a gracious host. The incident would be dissected and analyzed for weeks to come. But one thing was clear from the moment Roberts' heels stopped clicking on that studio floor. She had won this battle decisively, and Colbert would be dealing with the consequences for a very long time.